If you've ever had a best friend who felt more like an extension of your own body, you know how hard it is to tell them no. It feels like you're hacking away at a piece of your own flesh and memory. Brian and I had been tight since we were 16. We grew up playing sweaty pickup basketball on asphalt courts and skipping class to just hang out on the street corner. In high school, we were always in motion, never spending a single second worrying about where we were going tomorrow. That intense bond from our youth built an unconditional habit of always protecting each other. When you get too used to stepping in to clean up someone else's messes, you stop seeing where the danger line is drawn. But that blind trust is the exact loophole that allows a lethal threat to slip into your peaceful life. As we crossed into adulthood, life started picking sides and pushing the two of us down completely opposite tracks. I chose a safe, predictable, and boring path with a stable desk job downtown. My life cruised along smoothly with bills paid on time and quiet dinners alone in front of the TV. Brian took the opposite road, one full of chaos and uncertainty. He bounced constantly between construction gigs, delivery routes, and bartending shifts, but nothing stuck for more than a few months. He was always chasing shady investment schemes and get-rich-quick promises, slowly sinking deeper into the world of underground debt. He liked the feeling of being completely untethered, but it worried me the way a responsible adult worries about a reckless person. Even though busy schedules and lifestyle gaps meant we saw less of each other, that old loyalty was something I couldn't bring myself to sever. We still grabbed a few late-night beers every now and then, and he remained the only friend who truly knew the real me. Because of that, I was constantly torn between a fierce loyalty to my best friend and the instinct to protect the orderly life I had worked so hard to build. I had absolutely no idea that kindness and loyalty can sometimes be a one-way ticket straight into a bottomless pit with no escape. It all started late one night in mid-September. My phone suddenly buzzed violently against the wooden nightstand at 2 a.m. The screen lit up with Brian's name, a best friend I hadn't seen in weeks. I answered, feeling a mix of irritation and heavy sleepiness. "Hey, can you pick me up right now?" Brian's voice was tight over the line, both exhausted and unusually shaky. "I'm at an abandoned turnout along the highway heading out to the desert. Don't ask questions, just come." "You okay?" I asked back. "Just come get me," he snapped, and the line went dead. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen. My logical brain told me to lay back down and go to sleep because I had an important meeting the next morning. But our history had taught me one thing. When Brian said, "Don't ask questions," he was in deep trouble. I grabbed my hoodie, shoved my car keys into my pocket, and stepped out into the cold night. The highway cutting through the Texas desert at night looked like a perfect set piece for bad things to happen. The surroundings were completely dead, not a single car in sight. With only my headlights cutting through the darkness, I pulled over at the abandoned turnout just as Brian directed, a spot that used to be a dilapidated, torn-down gas station. The only light came from a faint crescent moon and the digital dashboard of my car. From a thick patch of brush by the roadside, a figure stumbled out. It was Brian. He was breathing hard, hair stuck to his forehead, and his face was completely drained of color. His hands were clutching a massive black duffel bag, like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. "Drive!" Brian yelled the second he yanked the door open and threw himself into the passenger seat. I slammed on the gas and sped away before I could even process what was happening. In the cramped space of the cabin, I could clearly hear his teeth chattering from sheer terror. "You hurt?" I glanced over and asked. "No. There's a smear that looks like blood on your sleeve." "It's not mine," he replied in a bone-chilling tone that made my stomach knot. "Brian, what the hell is in that bag, and what are you running from?" I tried to keep my voice steady to press him. He immediately turned his face away, staring straight through the pitch-black windshield in absolute silence. That terrifying silence felt like a solid wall, driving the tension inside the car to its absolute breaking point. At first, I tried to reassure myself that Brian was just overreacting due to his debt panic. I told myself he was just evading aggressive collectors from some illegal casino. "Hey Brian, if it's just about money, we can find a way to settle it or call the police," I said, trying to keep my voice completely flat to ease the suffocating atmosphere. But Brian didn't answer. He just stared blankly at the glowing phone screen on his lap. Suddenly, a dry text alert chimed from his phone. Brian flinched, trembling as he opened the message, and I could clearly see the muscles in his face twitch with terror. They're texting me, he whispered, his voice choking up in his throat. The text read, "You're running at 75 miles per hour on Route 9. In a silver gray Honda Civic, right?" My heart skipped a beat, and my foot unconsciously brushed against the brake pedal. I immediately looked up at the rearview mirror, then glanced at the two side mirrors. The highway behind us was pitch black, completely empty with not a single car in sight. There wasn't a single headlight from a stalker, not a single sign of life. A second text chime rang out, cutting through the roar of the engine. "The driver is wearing a black hoodie, and you're holding that bag way too tight." A cold shiver ran down my spine, making every single hair stand on end. They didn't need to be right behind us, but by some twisted way, they were looking straight inside this cabin. "Turn off the GPS. Turn off all the phones!" Brian screamed frantically, slamming his hand against the dashboard. Panicking, I jerked the wheel, veering sharply into a dark, secluded residential road to try and lose them. Right at that moment, my own personal phone suddenly started buzzing violently. A message from a completely unknown number arrived. I trembling tapped it open, and a wave of pure horror suffocated my chest. It was a photo taken straight at the front door of my own apartment downtown. Accompanying the photo was a short, cold line. "We know where you live. You're not innocent anymore." My only safe living space had now been breached and exposed to the predators. My sense of security completely collapsed, replaced by the brutal reality that I was locked into this game of survival. "They know my place, Brian. They took a picture of my door," I yelled. My hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Brian said nothing. He just cowered in the passenger seat, clutching the black duffel bag like a man who had lost his soul. Knowing I couldn't turn back, I threw my phone straight out the window. Into the darkness, I floored the gas pedal, driving the getaway car down unlit back roads, heading toward a temporary hideout in absolute terror. For the next week, Brian didn't leave my apartment. The thick curtains stayed drawn to keep even a single sliver of outside light from slipping in. The TV stayed off, and every single electronic device was completely unplugged to prevent any tracking. A terrifying silence, an atmosphere of suspicion, and absolute dread replaced every normal interaction between two friends. We barely spoke a single word to each other, except for brief, quick exchanges about food or using the bathroom. That silence pressed heavily on my chest, day in and day out, turning a home that used to be a peaceful sanctuary into a psychological prison. I was trapped in a state of horrific mental torture. Half of me wanted to go to the police station and report the whole truth to save myself, while the other half was torn by a fierce loyalty to protect my best friend's life. Every night I lay perfectly still in bed, but couldn't catch a single wink of sleep. Just hearing the sound of Brian's pacing and stumbling around the living room at 3 a.m. made my heart race, like it was going to burst out of my chest. On the 8th morning, I woke up and walked into the living room. The couch where he had been sleeping was completely empty. Brian had vanished into thin air without a single word of goodbye, taking that mysterious black duffel bag with him. The apartment's front door was still deadbolted from the inside, with absolutely no signs of a break-in or a struggle. He had just evaporated, leaving behind a hollow space that felt bone-chillingly cold. I immediately grabbed a burner phone to dial his number, but I only got a series of long, hopeless rings before being sent straight to voicemail. No texts, no social media posts. It was as if Brian had never existed in this world. About 2 months later, just as the fear was slowly fading like a changing bruise, I found a postcard in my mailbox. The front of the postcard was completely blank. No picture, no return address, just a single postal stamp. But on the back, Brian's uneven, sloppy handwriting stood out clearly. The message was incredibly short and cold, containing just 8 words that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Better you stay away from me. It's safer." The postcard didn't tell me where he was, who he was running from, or whether he was even alive or dead. It only confirmed one single thing. The darkness chasing him hadn't let go, and I absolutely had to stay out of it if I wanted to keep my own life. In the years since, I've had to learn to live with a massive void of information. People like to believe that if you care about someone enough, you can pull them back from wherever they're heading. But the truth is, sometimes their road is already too far gone, and all you can do is watch them disappear around the bend. I kept Brian's postcard deep inside my desk drawer, right under a stack of utility bills and old photos. Every few months, I take it out just to see if it feels any different. It never does. It's like holding a frozen piece of time. It's a reminder that I was pulled into something I didn't understand and barely escaped. Now, the focus of my life is no longer about finding answers to the mystery of that day. I don't care anymore about what was inside that black duffel bag or what Brian actually did to get hunted down. The only thing I have to face is how that event completely rewired my instincts toward the world around me. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on an empty sidewalk or spot a car in my rearview mirror, for too long the old fear comes rushing right back. I never told my parents about this story, and I never told anyone else either. It became my own sealed vault of memory, because I know that opening it means letting the danger spill back into my life. I've realized that Brian is the kind of gravity you never fully escape. Some people we love are storms themselves. They are beautiful, wild, unforgettable, but dangerous to stand too close to. You can care for them from a safe distance, but stepping into their world means losing your own. Sometimes, the ultimate survival instinct of a human being is simply learning to let go before the sky completely breaks open. Friendship and loyalty both have a strict survival boundary that we are not allowed to cross. This story doesn't bring a complete answer to the mystery, but it delivers a bone-chilling lesson. There are some relationships that can only exist when we accept standing from afar. I had less than $200 in my bank account. My rent was already a week late, and this morning the landlord taped a bright red warning notice right on my apartment door. I was 24 years old back then, fresh out of college with a bachelor's degree and a crushing mountain of student debt on my shoulders. I was lucky enough to land a short-term contract position at an old run-down medical building on the outskirts of Chicago. My job was to audit and reorganize a massive backlog of paper medical records that had been piling up for decades. The brutal pressure of just trying to survive exhausted me completely. Every lunch break, I could do nothing but sit with my knees pulled up to my chest inside my battered old car, with no appetite to eat, just crying hopelessly, because I didn't know how I was going to make it through the month. If I didn't finish that mountain of paperwork on time, my contract would be terminated, and I would be out on the street. The working environment in that medical building was suffocating, with a stark, rigid hierarchy of power. Low-level contract workers like me were always the most vulnerable targets, forced to take all the pressure and comply with management if we wanted any chance of a contract extension. At that time, my mind was completely disoriented and lost. I was so drained that I was ready to grab onto any hand reached out to me, ready to accept any outside intervention or help, as long as it kept me holding on to my only lifeline. Everything officially began on a late evening when I was sitting with my head buried in a mountain of old medical records in the office kitchen. I remember I was wiping away my tears with my sleeve when a middle-aged man walked in. He wore a gray suit that was impeccably tailored, exuding the elegance and power of an upper management executive. That was the first time I met Sterling, the head of the building's management. Sterling didn't ask me why I was crying. He just silently walked over, personally brewed a hot cup of coffee, and pushed it toward me along with a thick envelope. "Fix whatever is worrying you, Alana," he said in a calm, low, and deeply warm voice. "You're too young to look that tired." Inside the envelope was a cash bonus that was more than enough for me to pay off my late rent and buy groceries for the entire month. I tried to refuse right away, but Sterling just smiled and told me to consider it in advance on the contributions I was going to make here. Just a week later, Sterling used his influence to specially approve a full-time contract for me, with a salary that was double my initial starting rate. He officially became my direct mentor in a massive auditing project. Because Sterling was much older than me, I quickly grew to look up to him like a father figure, a solid anchor in the middle of this unfamiliar city. Sterling taught me how to navigate complex medical record clauses and showed me how to deal with the difficult doctors in the building. He frequently treated me to expensive lunches at upscale restaurants to discuss my future career goals. I truly believed that I was the luckiest person in the world to be chosen and protected by someone as powerful as Sterling. That overwhelming gratitude and absolute trust caused me to completely lower my guard, willingly placing myself in a state of psychological dependence on him without ever realizing that I was stepping straight into a carefully prepared trap. My dependence on Sterling grew with each passing week, but I didn't even notice it. After I signed the official contract, he transferred me to work permanently in the paper medical records archive room. This room was located deep down in the third basement level, a place completely cut off from everything, with thick concrete walls on all four sides and zero cell service. Every day I walked down there, it felt like I was completely disconnected from the outside world. Sterling began to interfere deeper into my life under the guise of being a caring manager. He would personally buy and bring expensive lunches down to the archive room for me every single day. "I don't want my best employee eating cheap canned food from the outside," he would always say with a warm smile. Later, Sterling started gifting me expensive designer office outfits. When I hesitated to accept because the gifts were too luxurious, his face would instantly change, and he would say my old clothes looked too simple and didn't fit the professional image he was building for me. I had no choice but to accept, because I didn't want to upset the person who had saved my life. But the personal boundaries between us began to blur in a terrifying way. Sterling knew the schedule of the bus routes around this area with creepy accuracy. Whenever I finished packing up my things and was about to leave the room to catch the bus, he would always appear right outside the archive room door at that exact moment. He would lean against the iron door frame, staring intently at me, and ask in a probing voice, "Alana, do you have any plans tonight? Are you going to meet anyone outside of work hours?" Those controlling questions about my private life became more and more frequent. It was no longer the concern of a boss for his employee. It felt like an invisible surveillance suffocating me down in that dark basement. I started to realize the anomalies and looked for ways to protect myself. Late one afternoon, while I was sorting through sealed archive boxes from 10 years ago down in the basement, I accidentally stumbled upon a forgotten personnel file. It was the file of my predecessor, a girl who had suddenly quit without any clear reason. Inside that brown manila folder were papers that made the blood freeze in my veins. They were restraining orders from the Cook County Court against Sterling for severe stalking and sexual harassment directed at that girl. Attached to them were a series of secretly taken photos and threatening messages in Sterling's own handwriting. Absolute terror washed over me, and I understood that I wasn't some lucky girl being mentored, but rather the next target of a predator. "I have to get out of here right now," I whispered into the darkness of the archive room. The very next day, I started drawing boundaries and tried to keep my distance from Sterling. When he brought over an expensive lunchbox like usual, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Thank you, boss, but from now on, I'll be bringing my own food. I'm on a strict diet." I also flat out refused a designer handbag he left on my desk, and at the same time, I requested to be moved up to the general office on the 4th floor to easily communicate with other departments. My rejection immediately triggered the dark side of Sterling. His polite, elegant smile vanished, replaced by a cold, flat expression and eyes as sharp as a razor. He stepped forward, backing me into the corner of the wall, and spoke in a deep, threatening tone. "Alana, you should remember who pulled you out of that mud of debt. Who do you think you are to turn your back on me? Don't be an ungrateful brat. It won't be good for your future." The fear turned into sheer panic when the protective system around me completely collapsed. I gathered all my courage and took the predecessor's file, along with the evidence, up to the Human Resources Department to report Sterling. But the HR manager just looked at the pile of papers, sighed, and pushed them back toward me with a hesitant look. "Sterling is the largest shareholder in this building's management board. His family funded all the medical equipment here," she said in a cold voice. "My sincere advice to you is to keep quiet and keep working. If you make a scene out of this, you will never get a job at any medical facility in Chicago again." Realizing that this organization only prioritized protecting those in power, I knew I was completely on my own. I went back to my office, wrote a brief resignation letter, left it on the desk, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the building that very afternoon. I blocked Sterling's phone number, blocked his social media accounts, and told myself that this horrific nightmare was finally over. I was completely wrong to think that leaving that place would bring me peace. For the next 2 weeks, Sterling began stalking me in the real world in a completely open and blatant manner. Every single night as midnight approached, his luxury black SUV would appear and park silently at the corner of the street directly opposite my bedroom window. Sterling didn't do anything at all. He just sat inside his car with the cabin light turned on and stared intently at my house for hours on end. The dangerous escalation reached its absolute peak at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning during a violent rainstorm. I was startled awake by a loud crack of thunder when I suddenly heard a distinct, repeated clicking sound coming from my back door. Someone was using a tool to pick the door lock and was actively trying to break inside. In a state of sheer, overwhelming panic, my mind went instantly to Sterling, and I realized that if I stayed in this house, I would die. I hurriedly grabbed my car keys, rushed out the front door, started the engine, and sped away into the blinding curtain of rain. The only thought driving me at that moment was finding a way to expose that old man's true face before the law. I remembered that the mini audio recorder containing the entire conversation of Sterling, threatening me, that day was still left behind inside the desk drawer in the basement archive room. That was the absolute piece of evidence that could allow the police to arrest him immediately. I frantically drove back to the old medical building and used my employee badge, which hadn't been deactivated yet, to sneak inside through the back entrance. The space inside the medical building at night was completely dark and as silent as a deserted tomb. I rushed down the concrete steps, heading straight toward the medical records archive room, located deep within the third basement level. The moment I stepped inside the suffocating room and finally located the audio recorder, a harsh, heavy thud echoed right behind me. The thick iron door of the archive room was suddenly slammed shut and locked completely from the outside. I lunged forward, banging violently against the small glass window on the iron door, and looked out into the pitch-black hallway. Sterling was standing right there, his gray suit completely drenched in rainwater, his face twisted into a warped, deformed smile under the dim, flickering light. "Alana, I told you that you could never run away from me." His voice echoed through the gap in the iron door, sounding as cold as grinding metal. "I didn't follow you home at all. I knew you would eventually come back here to get this thing." He held up the door key and slowly slipped it deep into his coat pocket. Right at that exact second, from the deepest, darkest corner behind the iron shelves of the archive room, a strange noise rang out. It was the unmistakable sound of iron chains clanking and dragging across the concrete floor, accompanied by a heavy, wild panting. A gaunt figure with tattered clothes and completely disheveled hair slowly crawled out from the shadows. It was my predecessor, the girl who had been officially reported as missing for a very long time. Her eyes were completely vacant and crazed. Her ankles were chained tightly to a structural concrete pillar of the building, and she was charging straight toward me with a wild, frantic shriek like a starved beast. I screamed out in terror, backing away into the corner and using every ounce of my strength to fight back as she lunged to claw and tear at me. Just when I thought I was going to be torn to pieces inside this basement, a high-powered flashlight suddenly beamed directly through the glass window. The heavy iron door was violently pried open by the police, using a crowbar after a few massive hits. It turned out that the neighbor at my apartment complex had immediately called the police when they saw a figure picking my back door lock, and the officers had tracked the GPS device on Sterling's car straight to this location. 4 police officers burst into the room, quickly pinning Sterling down onto the concrete floor and locking his hands with a pair of handcuffs. A female officer rushed over to hug me tightly, covering my eyes as the other officers began using bolt cutters to snap the chains for the poor girl. As Sterling was escorted away, his face showed absolutely no sign of fear. He only looked back at me with a gaze full of deep regret and disappointment. Sterling was later put on trial and received a sentence of life imprisonment for false imprisonment, stalking, and intentional injury. However, that victory could never heal what had been completely broken inside of me. Many months have passed now, but I still suffer from incredibly heavy psychological trauma and require long-term therapy. I have completely lost all trust in social relationships, looking at everyone around me with nothing but suspicion and intense wariness. I might be physically safe now, but my mind is still completely trapped down in that dark third basement level whenever the night falls. I work remotely as a software engineer. Since I deal with code and data all day, I've never bought into ghosts or stupid urban legends. I'm the type of guy who will always find a logical explanation for every weird noise in the house instead of hiding under the covers. But I decided to write down everything that happened to me last Friday night. That experience completely shattered my logical view of the world. I'm telling this story because I know that if a stubborn skeptic like me is too terrified to sleep, then what happened that night definitely wasn't just my imagination. Early last month, I signed a lease on a small, isolated house at the end of a cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio. My goal was to find absolute isolation. I needed to hyper-focus on finishing a massive project within 30 days, and I didn't want anyone bothering me. The neighborhood I chose was mostly retirees. After 8 o'clock at night, the whole block would fall into this dead silence, so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the door cracks. On that fateful night, my area got hit by a massive storm. The rain was pounding on the roof, and lightning just kept tearing through the pitch-black sky. Even with the terrible weather outside, I felt totally safe and cozy working inside my locked house. There was only one minor thing that happened earlier in the evening, right before the storm really hit. I opened the back door in the kitchen to quickly toss a trash bag out onto the porch. Just as I threw the bag, a blinding flash of lightning struck, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made me jump out of my skin. I immediately yanked the heavy wooden door shut and walked straight back to the living room. Everything happened so fast and it was so loud. Even now, looking back on it, I honestly can't say for sure if I actually manually turned the deadbolt or not. The clock struck exactly 2 in the morning, and my empty stomach started growling. I decided to pull out my phone and order a burger through a food delivery app. About 40 minutes later, my phone screen lit up with a notification that my order had been delivered. Almost at the exact same time, I heard 3 heavy knocks coming from the front door. I stood up, stretched, and went to open it. Out on the porch, there was only a soaking wet paper food bag sitting on the welcome mat. I looked around in the pitch black, but there was absolutely no sign of anyone. There was no sound of a car engine, or any headlights shining from the main road either. But with my usual logical mindset, I quickly reassured myself the driver must have sprinted back to his car to escape the pouring rain. I grabbed the soggy food bag, walked straight into the kitchen, and flipped on the bright lights. As I carefully took the burger box out, something unusual caught my eye. There was a yellow sticky note pressed firmly onto the lid of the box. Scrawled across the paper was a message written in bright red ink. The note read, "You forgot to lock your back door." My heart skipped a beat, but my rationality immediately pulled me back to reality. I scoffed and figured this was just some sick joke from a bored delivery driver trying to scare a customer. To prove myself right, I grabbed a small flashlight and walked straight to the back of the kitchen. I shined the light on the lock of the wooden door I had opened earlier that evening. The brass deadbolt was still resting obediently in the locked position. I let out a sigh of relief and shook my head, chuckling to myself. I had almost let a cheap prank scare me inside my own home. Just a few minutes after I returned to the living room, my phone suddenly vibrated once. It was a text message from an unknown number. The sender claimed to be my actual delivery driver from the app. The message read, "I'm sorry, sir. A large oak tree at the end of the alley was just struck by lightning and is blocking the road. So my car can't get into your neighborhood. It's raining too hard, so I had to leave your food bag at the bus stop out on the main road. The app is glitching and won't let me cancel the order. I hope you understand." After reading those words, cold sweat started pouring down my forehead. I stared blankly at the soaking wet paper bag sitting on the kitchen counter. It wasn't wrapped in any protective plastic layers at all, and it had been placed neatly on the welcome mat right in front of my door. Not out at the bus stop, with trembling hands, I picked up the yellow sticky note and brought it close to my eyes for a better look. The red ink on the paper was still sharp and completely unsmudged by the rain. This proved a horrifying truth. This note was only attached to the food box after the paper bag had been brought into a dry place. The person who brought the food bag from the bus stop on the main road, all the way to my front porch, was absolutely not the delivery driver. He had read my exact home address printed on the receipt. He had snuck around to my back door in the dark to physically check the lock himself. And only then did he circle back to the front to knock on the main door. At this point, This was definitely no longer a coincidence or a hallucination cooked up by my imagination. There was an unknown, faceless intruder directly targeting this house. I panicked, took a few steps back, and reached for the large meat cleaver on the kitchen counter. With my other trembling hand, I pulled out my phone to dial the police. Right at that moment, a blinding flash of lightning tore through the sky with a loud crack. The roaring thunder was followed by a massive power outage that killed the lights across the entire neighborhood. In the pitch-black darkness, over the sound of torrential rain battering the glass doors, another sound rang out. From the direction of the back door that I had personally checked just moments ago, a distinct click echoed clearly. It wasn't the sound of the door hinges being busted in from the outside. It was the dry, mechanical sound of the deadbolt being turned back. Someone had just unlocked the door from right inside this house. He had slipped into my house when I carelessly opened the door to take out the trash earlier in the evening. And now he was slowly unlocking it to clear an escape route for himself. Or worse, he was opening the door to let his accomplices inside. I didn't dare turn my head to look back down that dark hallway. I bolted for the front door, running for my life, and sprinted straight out into the blinding storm. I frantically pounded on my neighbor's door to get them to call the police. 20 minutes later, 2 armed police cruisers arrived, and the officers proceeded to search my entire house. They scoured every single room but couldn't find anyone hiding inside. My belongings hadn't been rummaged through, and there were no signs of any missing property. Everything seemed to have inexplicably returned to normal. But suddenly, the police chief called me into the guest bedroom, which shared a wall with my home office. He stayed completely silent and shined his flashlight directly underneath the empty bed. Right there was a puddle of rainwater and streaks of thick red mud. The officer told me that this specific type of red mud was only found at the active construction site next to the bus stop out on the main road. An unknown stranger had been lying completely still under this very bed for the past several hours. That very same night, I hurriedly packed my most essential belongings and got the hell out of there. I never returned to that suburban Ohio house ever again. I took the hit on breaking my lease and moved into an apartment on the top floor of a high-rise building. I carefully installed 4 heavy-duty steel deadbolts and set up security cameras in every single corner. Even though I am physically safe now, my psychological defenses have completely collapsed. Whenever there is a severe storm outside, my terrible insomnia comes rushing back. The more I piece together the details of that night, the more chills run down my spine. My case was officially closed because there were no casualties or stolen property. The local police just filed it away as an unlawful trespassing case with an unknown suspect. But a series of unanswered questions continues to haunt my mind every single night. Who exactly was that strange man? How long had he been lying dead silent under that bed while I was sitting there typing away in the very next room? How terrifying must his smirk have been in the pitch black of that room, especially during the exact moment he heard my footsteps walking over to check the back door, and then heard me muttering to reassure myself that I was still safe. Tonight, before you drift off to sleep, please do me a favor and double-check your locks one more time. Are you absolutely certain that you are the only one who just manually turned that deadbolt? I always thought I was someone who had complete control over my life. But this damn city has a way of quietly draining the last bit of life out of you. Crazy car horns blast against my apartment windows every single night. Work notifications flash constantly from early morning until midnight. It gets so suffocating that some days I feel like my chest is going to burst from a lack of oxygen. That is why I built my own rule for survival. Whenever I hit my limit, I throw my phone into the glove box, turn off all GPS tracking, and head straight into the deep woods. This trip was a little different from the others. I brought my girlfriend, Emily, along with me. She had just gone through a severe mental breakdown from the toxic pressure of social media. I wanted to give her a real space to heal, a place completely free of cell service, loud noises, and judgment. With 5 years of backcountry camping experience, I was extremely confident in my survival skills. I knew how to pitch a tent against the wind, build a fire with damp wood, and read a paper map fluently. That confidence gave me a sense of absolute control over the situation. We chose the Delaware Water Gap as our weekend getaway. This place is about an hour-and-a-half drive from the edge of the nearest town. It was close enough to not worry about medical emergencies, but far enough to enjoy the isolation. We arrived a little after 1 in the afternoon. The weather in New England at that time was absolutely perfect. Golden sunlight cut through the ancient oak trees, creating a picture-perfect scene of peace. On our hike out to the campsite, we even ran into 2 groups of hikers. They gave us a friendly wave and wished us a great trip. Seeing other people created an incredibly strong, false sense of security. It made me completely drop my guard and believe these woods were entirely harmless. We picked a flat, open clearing hidden behind a large ridge of rocks to set up camp. The area was sheltered by massive old trees that would take 2 people to hug. It was so quiet that the only sounds were birds chirping and the wind rustling gently through the leaves. Everything was peaceful and predictable, exactly as I expected. I watched Emily flash a rare smile for the first time in months of depression as she helped me stretch the tent tarp. At that moment, my biggest concern was simply whether a thunderstorm would hit tonight. I had no idea that the safety boundary I drew for ourselves had actually been violated the very moment our wheels rolled into the edge of the woods. Everything started to change around 4 in the afternoon. At that moment, I was bending down, hammering the last tent stake into the damp ground. Emily was sitting on a rotting log a few steps away, casually flipping through her leather-bound book. Suddenly, a sharp, crisp snap echoed from the thick brush right behind my back. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking on its own from decay. It sounded exactly like a heavy weight stepping hard on a dry oak branch. I immediately stood straight up, turned around, and focused all my attention toward the sound. There was absolutely no one in sight. Only a few wild rose bushes were shaking back and forth abnormally. The movement was distinct, even though there was absolutely no wind in the air. A cold chill ran down my spine, making me shudder slightly. The intuition of someone who often sleeps in the woods told me something was wrong, hiding in the shadows, but my rational mind immediately brushed that negative thought away a second later. I laughed at my own oversensitivity, blaming it on a ground squirrel or a white-tailed deer foraging late. I looked back at Emily and saw she was still absorbed in her book, so I didn't want to say anything to worry her. The feeling of being watched by an invisible pair of eyes began to take root in my chest. Still, the excitement of the trip quickly pushed that vague unease aside. About 30 minutes later, the muggy heat of the afternoon woods made us feel sticky and uncomfortable. I suggested to Emily that we find a cool water source nearby to wash off. We zipped the tent up securely and walked together along a narrow trail overgrown with weeds. After about 20 minutes of hiking, the sound of rushing water grew louder, leading us to a natural stream. The spot was tucked away behind large rock ridges and thick wild bushes, making it incredibly secluded. The stream water was crystal clear and ice-cold, letting us see straight down to the smooth pebbles on the bottom. Emily looked around and cheered with excitement. It had been so long since I last saw her this relaxed. Noticing that the surroundings were completely silent, with no other footprints, we decided to strip off our outer clothes and go for a swim. I picked up each shirt and pair of pants, carefully hanging all of our clothes on a low oak branch right by the bank. I intentionally smoothed out Emily's underwear and draped it right next to my jeans so they would dry quickly in the late afternoon sun. The cool water instantly washed away all the fatigue from our long trek. We soaked in the stream, talking and enjoying the rare peace of the wilderness, while Emily was tilting her head back to let the water wash over her hair. I suddenly heard a prolonged rustling sound. The noise came from the dense thicket directly across the stream, less than 30 feet from where we stood. The rustling sounded like something large was crawling flat against the ground, trying to squeeze into the leaves to avoid being seen. I narrowed my eyes and stared into the dark bushes for a good 30 seconds, but saw no further movement, thinking it was just a few small animals getting a drink. I went back to splashing around with Emily without suspicion. We washed up and enjoyed the spot for about 30 minutes until the last rays of daylight began to fade completely. As the chill of the deep woods rolled in, I took Emily's hand and stepped onto the bank to get dressed, but the moment I looked up at that low oak branch, my entire body froze like I'd been hit by an electric shock. I rubbed my eyes and looked over and over again to make sure I wasn't seeing things. Emily's entire outfit, from her sundress down to the underwear she had just taken off, was gone without a trace. The branch where the clothes hung was eerily empty. The most terrifying and insane part was that my t-shirt and heavy jeans were still sitting perfectly intact in the exact same spot. They hadn't shifted or shown any signs of being touched by even a single centimeter. The wood's wind couldn't selectively blow away only a woman's clothes. Wild animals would absolutely never do something that bizarre. A flesh and blood person had been standing right next to us in the darkness of that brush. He had quietly reached up to the branch and stolen her underwear while we were splashing around in the water. Emily immediately fell into a state of absolute panic. She wrapped her arms around her shoulders, her body shaking violently in the chill of the evening setting over the woods. Her tears poured out, mixing with the water droplets from the stream that hadn't dried on her cheeks yet. I quickly ripped off my thick windbreaker and threw it over her to cover her body. I held Emily tight in my arms, desperately searching for any logical reason to calm her down. I pursed my lips and said, "Hey, look at me, maybe a small bear or some curious wild animal dragged the clothes away." But the moment those words left my mouth, I knew how stupid and ridiculous it sounded. My logic immediately shattered that lie. A wild animal would never select items so meticulously. It couldn't leave my thick jeans and t-shirt behind, only to take Emily's dress and underwear. A much darker and more disgusting thought was crawling through my mind. Unable to let Emily keep shivering, with barely any clothes on, I took her hand and walked around the stream bank to search. I hoped that bastard had just accidentally dropped something around here. After a few minutes of frantic searching among the rock crevices, we suddenly discovered a small trail hidden behind a thorny bush. The signs of crushed grass and broken branches were very fresh, with sap still oozing out. Someone had clearly just run through here only a few minutes ago. I squeezed Emily's hand tight, pulling her along that trail deeper into the thick brush. We walked for about 100 meters before entering a small, dark clearing sheltered by low-hanging leaves. Appearing before our eyes was an old, tattered, moss-green canvas tent. It was set up in an extremely makeshift way and hidden very discreetly to avoid the eyes of any hikers on the main trail. I told Emily to step back a few paces behind a ridge of rocks just in case. I bent down and picked up a large, heavy dry branch to defend myself. My heart pounded in my chest as I took each step closer to that empty tent. I raised the branch, using the tip of the stick to lift the tattered curtain at the tent entrance to check inside. Instantly, a smell of mold, the foul stench of an unwashed body, and household garbage blasted straight into my nose. It was so overpowering that it made me almost gag right on the spot. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light inside, a horrifying sight slammed right into my view. Hanging loosely from all corners of the tent and scattered across the filthy ground were dozens of women's underwear of all colors and styles. Some pieces were old, moldy, and smelly, proving they had been here for a very long time. I realized immediately that this bastard was a dangerous creep who stalked and hunted women in these woods. A few seconds later, the blood in my veins froze completely as I looked right at the center of that disgusting mess. Emily's freshly stolen light pink underwear was placed neatly and smoothly on top of a mud-caked pillow. Terrifying fear mixed with pure disgust surged so heavily that my hands shook. I didn't want to linger in this godforsaken place for a single second longer. I crouched down, snatched my girlfriend's clothes, and immediately backed away, pulling Emily's hand tight as we turned to flee as fast as we could back to the old trail. We had just run out onto the small trail when the sharp snap of a branch echoed right above our heads. The sound was so loud that it made both of us freeze like statues. Emily and I looked up at the fork of a massive old tree hanging right over that makeshift tent. My heart seemed to stop at the sight unfolding before my eyes. A gaunt man with a hollow face, wearing ragged clothes covered in mud, was perched up there. He sat completely still like a ghost among the dense foliage. His eyes were rolled back, staring unblinkingly straight at Emily. His face twitched repeatedly, before slowly stretching into a twisted, deformed grin full of primal malice. That look was absolutely not that of a normal human being. He slowly tilted his head to the side in an unnatural way. A wheezing sound came from his throat, and then he spoke in a raspy, hollow voice like the scraping of rotting wood. He uttered a sentence in a freezing tone. "It's still warm. I just finished smelling it." That disgusting sentence felt like a knife stabbing straight into the back of my neck. The blood in my body froze completely. I realized a horrifying truth, that he hadn't just accidentally picked up those clothes when we left. He had crawled right up behind our backs while the two of us were swimming in the stream. He had been hiding in the bushes, directly witnessing everything, lusting and waiting for the moment we dropped our guard to make his move. Pure terror instantly triggered the strongest survival instinct inside me. I tightly grabbed Emily's trembling hand and dragged her away like a madman. We ran for our lives through the thick, thorny bushes. Sharp thorns tore at our flesh, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear chasing us from behind. I didn't dare look back even once, terrified I would see that man leaping down from the tree. When we made it back to the main campsite, our expensive tent and all our personal belongings were still set up there. I didn't even think about packing anything up. I used all my strength to shove Emily into the passenger seat of the van and slammed the door shut. I jumped quickly into the driver's seat, jammed the key in, started the engine, and stomped on the gas. The engine roared, echoing through the entire corner of the forest. The vehicle sped straight out onto the main highway, leaving behind that land filled with darkness and sin. I slammed on the gas until I saw the bright neon lights of a gas station. Right off the highway, that was the first place we stopped after our frantic escape from the woods. I rushed inside to the counter and immediately called the park rangers and state police. About an hour later, 2 patrol officers arrived to take our statements. They looked at Emily, who was curled up in the corner of a seat, wrapped tightly in my jacket and trembling speechlessly. After hearing my story about the moss-green canvas tent and the freak in the tree, the 2 officers immediately headed into the woods to check the scene. They told us to stay at the gas station and wait for the results. Close to 3 in the morning, the patrol car returned. They confirmed they found the moss-green canvas tent hidden in the brush, exactly as I described. Inside, there were indeed dozens of pieces of women's underwear hanging everywhere. But that twisted man had completely vanished into the wild night. There was not a single trace left behind, except for that disgusting pile of clothes and the mud-caked pillow. The police also helped us gather our expensive tent and personal belongings left behind at the clearing. They handed everything back to me after a few days of paperwork, and physically, the danger seemed to be temporarily over. We returned to our safe apartment in the middle of the city, but the true peace in our souls had completely shattered. A secure home with a triple-locked door could no longer bring a sense of safety to Emily. She couldn't close her eyes to sleep unless the room was brightly lit. Every time a strong wind howled through the glass window panes, she would wake up in a panic and scream in despair. I wasn't doing any better myself. Now, every time I catch a whiff of damp wood rising from a potted plant, or the smell of rotting leaves after a rain shower, my entire body shudders. Every single pore tightens, and goosebumps break out across my skin involuntarily. The most horrifying obsession isn't what happened, but what is still ongoing. I know that gaunt man with the twisted, mud-caked smile is still out there, completely free. He is still hiding somewhere beneath the dense oak canopy of another forest. He is patiently perched on a high tree branch, staring unblinkingly with his eyes rolled back, waiting for his next victims to drop their guard. This happened late last fall when I traveled to an old industrial town in Michigan for an electrical repair project. My project was scheduled to last for a week. Since the budget was tight, my company bypassed major hotels and booked a cheap short-term rental online instead. The apartment was located inside a rundown building complex built back in the 80s. It sat completely isolated on the edge of an industrial park, and the surrounding area got chillingly desolate at night. The moment I stepped out of my truck at dusk, the bleak atmosphere and the extreme silence of the building gave me a strange sense of dread. I walked up to the entrance and retrieved the key from a lockbox hanging on the main gate. I never met the host in person, communicating only through automated text messages. My unit was located at the very end of the 3rd-floor hallway. It was a long, dim corridor with faded gray carpeting that smelled heavily of mildew. Most of the neighboring doors were tightly shut, with zero signs of anyone actually living there. The place felt more like an abandoned structure than a residential building. The inside of the apartment was fairly spacious, but the interior was incredibly dated and worn out. Large living room windows looked straight down onto an overgrown, abandoned parking lot below. On the wooden dining table in the middle of the room, I found a house manual left by the host. Right below the Wi-Fi rules, he had scribbled a very brief handwritten note. The building is undergoing maintenance, so the hallway lights might flicker. Make sure to lock your doors tightly at night. The host offered no further explanation or context for that warning. The absolute silence, broken only by the wind whistling against the window, combined with that vague warning, made my chest tighten. I just stood frozen in the middle of the living room, feeling a profound sense of unease. Something was definitely wrong with this entire place. I got back to the apartment at 10 p.m. After finishing my first late shift, I proceeded to lock the room door using both the deadbolt and the safety chain above. When I turned the lock, I felt the metal turning roughly, and the lock felt unusually loose. I leaned down to inspect the latch receiver closely and discovered a thin, transparent piece of plastic intricately inserted inside. This piece of plastic prevented the deadbolt from fully engaging into the frame, even though the door looked completely closed from the outside. I reassured myself that perhaps the previous tenant had jammed some trash there, or the host inserted it to prevent rattling during high winds. I used a small screwdriver from my toolbox to pry that piece of plastic out, locked the door tightly, and went to sleep. The next evening, I finished my work at the factory and returned to the apartment around 11 p.m. Right as I stood in front of the door to insert my key, I went numb, finding that same thin piece of plastic back in the exact same spot. This repeated occurrence confirmed for a fact that someone had accessed my room lock while I was away at work. I immediately opened the door and rushed inside, turning on all the lights to check under the bed, the closet, and the bathroom. My wallet and laptop were still sitting untouched on the work desk. With absolutely no signs of being ransacked, I messaged the host through the online app to report the strange condition of the lock. He only replied with a brief sentence. "It's probably just the building staff doing a routine inspection. You have nothing to worry about." The host downplaying the severity left me with a vague sense of unease, but I couldn't prove a thing. By the third night, the threat was no longer just indirect signs. Everything had shifted into a direct attack on my living space. At 1 a.m., I was lying awake in bed in the dark when I heard a faint rattling sound coming from the front door. I held my breath and sat up, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I took the quietest steps possible out to the living room and pressed my eye against the peephole. Outside in the dim hallway, I was horrified to see two tall men with hoods pulled over their heads standing right outside my door. One guy was holding a professional lock-picking tool and continuously working on the lock. The sound of metal scraping echoed clearly in the dead silence. I heard the deadbolt lock start to shift loosely. It turned out they had already slipped the thin piece of plastic back into the door frame without me ever noticing. While I was standing there frozen in terror, another sound echoed from behind me. It was a soft scratching sound against the glass of the living room window facing the abandoned parking lot. I slowly peered through the gap in the curtains. Under the dim moonlight, a third person was crouching on the iron fire escape outside the window. He was using a thin, sharp blade to try and pry open the glass window latch. They were attacking me from multiple directions at the exact same time. The heavy psychological pressure suffocated me as every escape route was completely cut off. My heart was racing and my reaction time was shrinking by the second. I realized with horror that this was absolutely not a random petty burglary. This was an organized hunting plan, and I was their target. This situation had completely exceeded what a lone person like me could handle. Right after that, the main door lock let out a dry click, signaling they had disabled the first layer of locking. With no way out left, survival instinct forced me to act immediately. I rushed forward, using all my strength to drag the heavy sofa in the room to barricade the front door shut. At the same time, I quickly pulled the phone out of my pocket and dialed 911 for emergency rescue. I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to keep my voice from trembling, and whispered in pure panic to the dispatcher. "Someone is breaking into my room. There are multiple guys, and I am completely surrounded." The two sides fell into a direct standoff through the thick wooden door. The men outside quickly realized I had noticed them and began throwing their weight against the door. The heavy sofa was pushed back a few centimeters across the floor. A hand wearing a black glove shoved entirely through the cracked opening, groping around to unlatch the remaining safety chain at the top. Time felt like a countdown in my sheer panic. At the same time, the man outside the window started pounding hard on the glass, trying to shatter it to get inside the living room. Right at the exact moment the door was about to be completely kicked in, the frantic wail of police sirens echoed from the end of the street. Red and blue lights swept sharply across the curtains, illuminating the dark room. Hearing the approaching authorities, the attackers stopped instantly. Their panicked footsteps scrambled in a chaotic rush down the rear fire escape stairwell, to retreat just before the police closed in on the scene. Once the scene was secure, the officers proceeded to take my statement. An older, experienced officer walked up to me and revealed a horrifying truth. Over the past 6 months, there had been 2 similar incidents in this area involving men staying alone for work. The victims were all out-of-town workers visiting for short-term projects. The officer explained that the small piece of plastic in the doorframe was used as a tool to tag the room and disable the lock. He stated they believed a local group was following out-of-town men from work sites, waiting until they were isolated to try and get inside their rooms. The police suspected the host was actually an accomplice who deliberately listed the apartment at a cheap rate to lure individuals staying alone. All the initial warnings and his coldness in the text messages now became perfectly clear and purposeful. The revealed truth left my entire body trembling, and I instantly changed my mind about this business trip. I chose to abandon my goal of finishing the repair project, even though I still had work scheduled for the next day. Immediately, I called my company manager to explain the entire situation and asked to pull out of the project. Acting on the horrific experience I just went through, I understood that my life was more important than anything else. I put my personal safety first and decided I had to leave this town right then and there in the middle of the night without hesitating for another single minute. I quickly packed all my clothes and tools into my backpack under the protection of the 2 officers waiting in the hallway. Before leaving, I knelt down to check under the bed one last time to see if I had dropped any personal belongings. Deep inside the dark corner against the wall, I noticed a strange object sitting out of place. It was a small piece of folded paper shoved right into the corner of the carpet, somewhere a normal tenant would never notice. The paper was torn into a small square from a local newspaper. When I unfolded it under the light, goosebumps broke out across my skin, and my spine went completely cold. On the back of the newspaper clip, someone had used a pen to write down my details in precise handwriting. It listed my exact room number, my license plate, and the make of the truck I was driving. Right next to that was a detailed schedule of the times I left for work and returned over the past 2 days. Every line of text was written cleanly and neatly in ink. That tiny piece of evidence carried immense weight for me at that moment. It confirmed that all my previous fears and paranoia were completely justified. I hadn't chosen the wrong room, and they certainly hadn't picked me at random. I had been watched, hunted, and targeted by a group of people who planned this from the start. I shoved the piece of paper into my pocket, walked quickly out of that rundown apartment building, and never looked back. I got into my truck, locked all the doors, started the engine, and officially left that horrific place at 3 in the morning. Outside, a thick fog had begun to blanket the desolate roads. During the entire 2-hour drive back home in the dead of night, I kept checking my rearview mirror constantly. I was continuously scanning for any headlights, silently tailing me from behind. But the journey passed in total silence, and no more dramatic events occurred. What the true motive of that group was remains an unanswered question to this day. Whether they wanted to kidnap me for ransom, rob me, or had a far more sinister plot against isolated workers, all of it will forever remain a mystery left behind in the shadows of that old industrial town. My story in that place had come to an end, but it left a chilling, lingering effect and a massive void in my imagination whenever I have to travel far. It always reminds me that danger and stalkers out there are completely real, and that nightmare could easily play out again at any other sublet unit we accidentally step into. I moved into a shared house on the outskirts of Oregon in late autumn. The area was nearly an hour's drive from downtown, It was surrounded mostly by pine forests and long stretches of road with very little traffic. At night, there was almost no light from nearby residential areas. I rented the room through a housing management app. The entire process, from signing the contract and making the payment to receiving the door code, was automated. I never met the landlord in person. The only thing I received was an instruction message with an access code sent through the system. The house was not new, but it was kept clean and organized. Inside, several private rooms were arranged along a main hallway. The kitchen and living room were shared spaces. Cameras were installed at the entrance, in the hallway, and in the kitchen. The door lock system used a separate electronic code for each tenant. Every entry and exit was recorded in the app, including the time and the access code used. The landlord explained that this was meant to ensure security and prevent disputes between tenants. I accepted that without suspicion. Compared to other places I had lived in, this system even gave me a clearer sense of control. The other tenants in the house kept different schedules. Some worked during the day, some worked night shifts, and some stayed only for a short period before leaving. I rarely met them face to face. Most of the time, I only heard doors closing, brief footsteps in the hallway, or saw someone pass through the kitchen for a moment. There was no meaningful social interaction. There were no conflicts or signs of tension among the people living there. Each person seemed to exist within a separate schedule. My room was a small one on the ground floor, near the end of the hallway. Inside, there was only a bed, a work desk, and a wardrobe. The window looked out toward the backyard, where several tall trees blocked most of the streetlight. At first, life there was stable. I went to work during the day, came home in the evening, ate, then stayed in my room to work or rest. Nothing remarkable happened in the shared areas. The house was very quiet. The only sounds were the heating system running, and occasionally, the wind moving through the forest behind the house. The hallway lights turned on and off automatically through motion sensors, leaving the space in a constant state of half-light and shadow. During the first few days, all the data in the app matched perfectly. The door logs, camera records, and daily routines showed no inconsistencies. There were no signs of intrusion or any unusual activity. I began to see the house as a safe and stable living environment, one where everything was controlled by systems rather than by people. The place gave me a clear sense of order, almost as if there was no room for randomness to interfere. In the beginning, I had no reason to suspect anything about what was happening inside that house. About a week after I moved in, very small inconsistencies began appearing in the kitchen. At first, they were unclear details, a glass placed a few centimeters away from where I remembered leaving it. A food container in the refrigerator that seemed to have been opened and closed without my memory of using it. There were no clear signs that these were intentional actions, nor any evidence strong enough to confirm simple mistakes. I told myself I might have forgotten, or another tenant might have used the shared space. In a shared house, this was not unusual. However, one tenant on the upper floor began posting in the group chat. They mentioned hearing the refrigerator door opening at night, when everyone was supposed to be asleep and the lights were off. No one responded clearly. The conversation quickly fell silent. These incidents always occurred late at night, between after midnight and around 2 a.m., a period when the entire house was almost completely inactive. No one reported clear footsteps, no heavy sounds such as doors closing or objects being moved. Only indirect signs that something had interacted with objects in the kitchen. I started paying closer attention to the kitchen area. Before going to bed, I tried to memorize the exact positions of items. The next morning, some details would still be slightly different. I checked the hallway and kitchen camera system. There was no footage of anyone entering or leaving outside the registered schedule. The electronic lock system did not record any new access codes. All system data indicated there had been no intrusion from outside, yet the actual physical state of the environment did not fully match what the system and records suggested. I began to realize this was not an isolated event. The small changes had a pattern of repetition, not large enough to be classified as a break-in, but sufficient to suggest that something was interfering with the shared living space. At this stage, no one had identified the cause. There was no direct evidence of an outsider, only a persistent mismatch between system data and the lived experience of the tenants in the house. After multiple scattered reports of objects being displaced, the tenant on the upper floor requested a full inspection of the house. We began systematically checking every area. Kitchen cabinets, living room, hallway, and private rooms were inspected one by one. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches, no physical evidence suggesting external intrusion. The landlord was contacted through the management app. Their response was brief. The system had not recorded any abnormal access. All door codes still belonged to the registered tenants. However, when the kitchen details were cross-checked again, some inconsistencies began to show repetition. Certain objects were not only displaced but rearranged into a specific order. Glasses were aligned more neatly than before. Items inside cabinets were grouped in a more structured way. No one in the house admitted to doing this. A notable point emerged when the kitchen camera footage was reviewed again. There was a small blind spot near the dining table area. This angle did not capture the entire working space. It created a visual gap in the surveillance coverage. The tenant on the upper floor began documenting the exact position of each item before going to sleep. I also started observing in the same way. Every night, we checked object placement and took photos for comparison. In the following days, the discrepancies continued. However, there was still no direct visual evidence of anyone performing these actions. The camera did not record any clear movement during the time window when the changes occurred. The situation shifted into a conflict of perception. System data indicated no intrusion. Physical observation indicated a structured intervention in the living space. No one could determine whether this was a technical malfunction, another tenant's behavior, or an external factor not being recorded. Tension in the house increased, but it had not reached panic levels. People began to stay silent more often and observe each other instead of communicating. After the observation phase, the phenomena started to develop a more consistent pattern. The changes were no longer random. They began appearing at fixed time intervals. The time window of 2:17 a.m. became a recurring point of interest. Almost every system log review showed some form of access occurring at that exact time. Not every night, but frequent enough to form a recognizable pattern. Objects in the kitchen were not only moved, but adjusted. Glasses were placed in straighter alignment. Chairs were pulled out and then returned to a balanced position. Small items were organized in a way that no one in the house claimed responsibility for. One night, the upper floor tenant went into the kitchen before I did. They reported that the kitchen light was already on. No one was inside, but a dining chair had been pulled away from the table as if it had just been used. There were no loud sounds, no signs of haste, only the condition of a space that had already been occupied. After that incident, we changed our routines. 2 people decided to sleep in the living room to monitor the area. Others kept personal belongings closer instead of leaving them in the kitchen or shared spaces. During one night of observation, a phone camera captured the kitchen door opening very slowly. There was no clear force applied, only a subtle movement, almost as if trying not to make a sound. When we turned on the light immediately afterward, there was no one in the area. No signs of escape, no sound of departure, but when the space was checked again, several objects had shifted once more. The psychological state in the house began to shift into prolonged tension. The discussion was no longer about whether the phenomenon existed or not. It became a question of when it would happen again. People started packing essential personal belongings. Some prepared to leave if necessary. No one maintained normal living routines anymore. The living space was no longer treated as stable or safe. It had become a system operating under an unknown logic that no one fully understood. After the final night of observation, no one in the house wanted to stay any longer. There was no extended debate. The decision to leave was quick and almost unanimous. We packed in silence. No one spoke much about what had happened. Everyone focused only on leaving the space as soon as possible. There was no direct confrontation with any identifiable actor. No clearly defined moment where the cause of the events could be confirmed. Only an accumulation of signs that made staying no longer reasonable. We left the house early in the morning. The daylight outside did not reduce the lingering sense of tension built up over multiple nights. The front door closed normally. With no visible damage, sitting in the car, I checked the management app one last time. The access log still showed a single entry at exactly 2:17 a.m. The data did not disappear, even though no one remained inside the house. No one returned to verify further. No official report was filed. The situation ended only at a personal level among the tenants. After leaving, I moved to a new place with a different security system. However, the habit of checking doors and monitoring electronic locks persisted. Each time I saw an access log, I checked it more than necessary. Occasionally, I noticed small inconsistencies in the access history at the new residence. Not strong enough to confirm an actual event, but sufficient to trigger recollections of the previous house. There was no explanation for the origin of the 2:17 a.m. access. It could not be confirmed whether it was a system error, human activity, or a form of unregistered access. The house was left behind as a system that continued operating without requiring anyone to understand what it was doing, and I never returned to verify it again.